At 13 inches the morning, the radar picture looks wrong. Not empty, not full, but poisoned by speed. Tiny returns begin to multiply across the outer edge of the screen, then split, then bloom, until the operator is no longer watching targets. He is watching time itself drain away. A destroyer can survive a few inbound drones. It can survive a messy attack. What it cannot survive is a collapsing decision window, the moment when every blip becomes a question and every question steals another second from the ship's defense. The old model says the warship waits, detects, tracks, decides, and fires from its own bubble. But the new battlefield punishes anything that waits inside its own skin. In the next phase of naval warfare, the ship does not wait to be attacked. It throws defense outward, far from the hull, far from the deck, far from the place where a miss still becomes shrapnel, shock, flame, and loss. That is the real promise of drone motherships. They do not just carry drones. They move the fight away from the ship before the ship becomes the fight. This is Battletech Declassified. Modern Warfare Explained. Think of the drone mothership as a moving hive that carries smaller defenders into the sky, into the sea lanes, into the dead space between detection and disaster. Instead of launching protection at the last second from the ship itself, a fleet can push interceptor drones, sensors, decoys, and electronic warfare nodes far ahead, far off to the side, or along the most likely attack corridors. That changes everything. The geometry changes. The timing changes, the economics change, even the psychology changes, because the attacker is no longer meeting a single warship with a finite stack of missiles. He is entering a layered, shifting web where defense can appear from strange angles and from much greater range than expected. This episode is about that shift, how drone motherships launch defense at range, why that matters in a saturation fight, why it could become one of the most important changes in modern military doctrine, and why the side that learns to defend forward may force its enemy to spend more, reveal more, and die farther away from the target. For more than a century, defensive warfare at sea has been built around a simple picture: the valuable unit, the carrier, the destroyer, the amphibious ship, the tanker, the convoy leader, carries its own eyes and its own fists. Yes, fleets share data. Yes, aircraft, helicopters, satellites, and escorts help build the larger picture, but emotionally and tactically, the ship remains the center of its own survival. Threat comes inward, defense goes outward from the hull. That model made sense when the pace of attack was slower, the number of simultaneous threats was smaller, and every launch platform required more effort, more fuel, more crew, and more preparation. But cheap drones, loitering munitions, autonomous seekers, and mass-produced precision attack systems have begun to break that math. A single expensive ship can now face dozens, sometimes hundreds of cheap airborne problems, and each one does not need to sink the ship by itself. It only needs to force a reaction, consume a missile, trigger confusion, or open a gap for the next wave. That is why drone motherships matter. They are not merely another gadget in a crowded military catalog. They are an attempt to redraw where defense begins. Picture a medieval castle that used to rely on archers on the wall. Then imagine that same castle sending mounted patrols, mobile shields, signal towers, and ambush teams miles beyond the gate, so the enemy is harassed, identified, divided, and weakened long before the first ladder touches stone. That is what a mothership can do for a modern force. It can carry the defensive layer away from the core asset and place it closer to the likely path of attack. It can hold smaller interceptor drones like arrows in a quiver, ready to release them where they buy the most time. And time is the currency that matters most in a saturation battle. Not just ammunition, not just range, not just radar power. Time. Because if you can move the first defensive action 10, 20, or 50 kilometers outward, then the same fleet suddenly has more seconds to classify, more angles to shoot from, more chances to re-engage, and more ways to survive the wave. Range in warfare is often misunderstood. People hear the word and imagine power, bigger missiles, stronger engines, farther shots. But defensive range is not just about how far a weapon can fly. It is about where the battle begins. and who gets to shape the first move. If an incoming drone swarm is first engaged only when it nears the protected ship, then the defender is fighting in a shrinking room. Every second is more crowded than the last. Every failed interception becomes more dangerous than the one before. Debris matters more. Misidentification matters more. Friendly fire risk increases. The ship's own radar horizon, deck layout, missile inventory, crew fatigue, and electronic signature all become part of the attacker's opportunity. The closer the fight comes to the ship, the more the defender is forced into emergency mode, where choices are compressed and the margin for error becomes razor thin. A drone mothership stretches that room. It creates a larger arena in which the defender can act sooner and from better positions. Think of it like moving a goalkeeper out from the goal line and giving him teammates to challenge the striker before the shot is taken. Suddenly, the attack must pass more tests, solve more puzzles, and survive more encounters before it can threaten the net. The mothership itself may not be heavily armed. It may not even be glamorous. But by launching small defensive drones at range, it can transform the battle from a panicked close-in scramble into a distributed interception problem. Some of those small drones may carry mini missiles. Others may ram, jam, blind, or lure. Others may simply extend sensing and cue shooters elsewhere. The key idea is that defense no longer has to wait for the attacker to enter the ship's personal space. It can meet the threat in the hallway, in the parking lot, on the road leading in, and in modern warfare, whoever controls that hallway usually controls the rhythm of the battle. The deadliest thing about a swarm is not only the number of drones, it is the clock that comes with them. Each inbound object forces a tiny sequence: detect, validate, classify, prioritize, assign, engage, verify. That chain sounds clean on a briefing slide. In reality, it becomes a traffic jam. Sensor operators see clutter. Algorithms sort weak tracks from strong ones. Officers hesitate over uncertain identities. Launchers cycle. Data links strain. Different weapons have different flyout times, seekers, and reliability. Now multiply that by 20, then 50, then 100. Suddenly, the battle is less about individual drones and more about whether the defender's system can keep pace with the incoming math. A swarm is a stress test disguised as a weapon. It asks whether your whole architecture can make enough good decisions fast enough before the cost of being late becomes catastrophic. Drone motherships attack that timing problem at its roots. By moving defensive assets forward, they do not just add extra interceptors, they create parallel decision lanes. A mothership patrolling along a likely axis can detect, relay, launch, and even locally prosecute a threat before the ship's own inner defensive stack is forced to react. That matters because a swarm wants all your decisions to happen at once. The mothership says no. Some of those decisions will happen earlier, farther away, under less pressure. Imagine a crowded restaurant kitchen at dinner rush. If every order arrives to one chef at the same moment, chaos follows. But if prep stations are distributed, ingredients are staged in advance, and some tasks are handled before the final cook line, the whole kitchen survives the rush. The mothership is a forward prep station for defense. It buys time, offloads tasks, and breaks the attacker's dream of one overwhelming moment. And once you understand warfare as a contest over synchronized timing rather than just hardware, the value of launching defense at range becomes almost impossible to ignore. The word mothership can mislead people. It sounds cinematic, like a giant carrier drone packed with futuristic machines, floating above the battlefield like something from science fiction. Sometimes that image helps. More often it distracts. In practical military terms, a mothership is simply a larger platform that carries, deploys, supports, or coordinates smaller systems, which then perform the actual mission at the decisive point. That larger platform could be an aircraft, a ship, an unmanned surface vessel, a truck, or something more unusual. Its purpose is not to do everything by itself. Its purpose is to bring the right cluster of tools closer to the place where those tools matter most. In this episode, the mission is defense at range. So the mothership's job is to move the outer defensive layer forward, keep it mobile, and give it enough endurance, sensing, and command support to function far beyond the immediate reach of the protected asset. That distinction matters because it keeps us grounded. We are not talking about magic. we are talking about logistics and geometry made smarter. A fighter aircraft carrying small air-to-air drones could be a mothership. A patrol vessel releasing interceptor quadcopters and decoys could be a mothership. A long-endurance unmanned aircraft orbiting ahead of a task force, loaded with autonomous defensive drones, could be a mothership. Even a land-based truck that launches loitering interceptors to defend an airfield can fit the logic. The common thread is that the main platform extends the reach of defense by carrying smaller assets into useful positions and releasing them when the battle demands it. Like a backpacker carrying water filters, rope, and tools so the team can cross terrain safely, the mothership is valuable because it enables the smaller systems to arrive where they otherwise could not. The war is still won by sensors, timing, autonomy, discipline, and cost-effective action. The mothership just makes those elements show up on the battlefield in the right place before the crisis fully forms. What exactly might a defensive drone mothership carry? Start with the most obvious answer: interceptor drones. These are the small hunters released to chase, collide with, jam, or destroy incoming threats. Because they are smaller and cheaper than ship-launched missiles, they can be used more freely in high-volume fights. Next comes sensor drones, the flying eyes and ears that push the detection line outward and provide better angle diversity for tracking low, fast, or cluttered targets. Then come electronic warfare nodes, platforms designed not to explode anything directly, but to scramble links, confuse seekers, interfere with navigation, or create false cues that make enemy drones waste time or miss. Add decoys, small systems whose entire purpose is to look important, pull fire, or trigger enemy behavior early. Add communications relays, which matter more than most people realize, because a forward defensive web only works if information can move smoothly between pieces. This is where the concept becomes powerful. The mothership does not have to choose only one kind of payload. It can mix them like tools in a mechanic's van. A few interceptors for hard kills, a few jammers for soft kills, a few decoys to reshape enemy behavior, a few relays to hold the network together, a few passive sensors to see without shouting. Suddenly, the defended force is not just launching bullets. It is launching a small ecosystem. Think of a gardener dealing with pests. One strategy is to keep spraying the plants when the insects arrive. A better strategy is to place traps, beneficial insects, barriers, and sensors around the garden before the infestation peaks. The mothership turns defense into ecosystem management. It lets a force tailor the outer layer to the threat, the weather, the geography, and the expected attack pattern. And because those payloads can change from mission to mission, the same mothership architecture can remain useful even as the specific threats evolve. Flexibility is part of the weapon. The cheapest successful defensive action is not always the one that blows something up. That point becomes clearer the more you think about range-launch defense. A small interceptor drone that destroys an inbound threat with a collision is useful, but so is a jamming drone that causes the attacker to lose navigation and drift harmlessly away. So is a decoy that causes the enemy to reveal positions, burn fuel, or waste its own limited munitions. So is a sensor drone that never fires at all, but allows the right target to be assigned to the right shooter before confusion sets in. The mothership's strength is that it can launch many forms of defensive effect, not just kinetic destruction. In a high-end fight, that matters because the enemy is rarely presenting a single clean target set. He is mixing decoys with real threats, cheap noise with dangerous payloads, and electronic tricks with physical attack. Meeting that with one kind of defensive answer is like bringing only a hammer to repair a house. This is why future defense may look more like choreography than brute force. A mothership can launch a sensor pair to establish track quality, a jammer to break hostile coordination, and an interceptor drone to finish any target that remains dangerous after the soft kill layer has done its work. That sequence could cost far less than firing a large missile from the protected ship, and it could happen earlier in the engagement timeline. More importantly, it can happen in different combinations, depending on the threat. Against a slow-mass drone raid, soft kills might do most of the work. Against a fast terminal dive threat, the defender may skip straight to kinetic action. Against a mixed swarm, the mothership could assign different tools to different pieces of the raid. Picture a football defense that no longer waits on the goal line. It sends one player to read the quarterback, another to cut the crossing route, another to pressure the pocket, and a fourth to protect deep space. That is what the defensive web becomes. The mothership is the coach, bus, and supply locker that gets those players onto the field before the snap. There is another reason launching defense at range is so attractive. It changes perspective. Sensors, located on or near the protected ship, see the battle from one cluster of angles. That can be enough in a simple engagement. It becomes dangerous in cluttered conditions, low-altitude approaches, bad weather, coastal terrain, or mixed civilian traffic. Targets that appear ambiguous from the ship's viewpoint may become obvious from another angle entirely. A drone mothership, especially one positioned ahead or offset from the fleet, creates the possibility of seeing the same threat from multiple geometries. That improves classification, reduces track confusion, and makes target handoff more reliable. In other words, the mothership does not merely add more eyes, it adds better perspective. Anyone who has tried to catch a ball in bright sunlight understands the principle. From one angle, the ball disappears in glare. Move 10 steps, and the problem vanishes. Warfare works the same way. An incoming drone flying low over waves may be hard for a shipboard sensor to isolate cleanly, especially if the target is small and mixed with clutter. But a sensor drone launched from a mothership above and to the side may see it clearly. A passive sensor out on the flank may detect emissions that the ship cannot hear well from its position. A relay node may preserve track continuity when one line of sight is broken. This multi-angle picture is priceless because the attacker wants ambiguity. He wants the defender unsure whether the contact is harmless, fake, or lethal. He wants weapons wasted on decoys and real threats ignored until too late. A forward-launch defensive architecture fights that uncertainty by widening the defender's viewpoint. And when range gives you time, while perspective gives you confidence, the whole decision chain becomes stronger. Defense at range is not just about shooting sooner. It is about knowing more, earlier, and with greater certainty. Let us walk through how a drone mothership engagement might begin. A task force is moving through contested waters. Intelligence suggests a hostile coast or patrol network may launch massed drones, perhaps mixed with decoys and electronic noise. Instead of keeping all defensive tools clustered around the ships, commanders send one or more mothership platforms outward. Some patrol ahead along likely approach corridors. Some sit on the flanks. Some remain farther back as reserve launch nodes. These motherships carry small interceptors, passive sensors, jammers, decoys, and network relays. Their purpose is not simply to wait for the fight. Their purpose is to shape the battle space before the enemy decides to strike. That means listening, watching, mapping clutter, testing communications, and positioning for the first useful release. Now the first suspicious tracks appear. Maybe a line of small objects rises from the coast. Maybe a few contacts pop low over the sea from fishing traffic. Maybe the attack begins with electronic interference meant to hide the real direction of the raid. In the old model, the protected ship absorbs that first uncertainty. In the mothership model, forward systems begin sorting the problem immediately. A passive sensor drone launched from the mothership can move closer without revealing much. A relay drone may climb to keep line of sight clean. If the threat picture worsens, the mothership can release a first wave of defensive drones before the target ever enters the ship's inner engagement zone. That is the key moment. The defender has not waited for panic range. He has acted while the geometry still favors him. Some defenders may only classify, some may only jam, some may commit to intercept. But because the action starts farther out, the fleet gains more than a first shot. It gains time for second shots, for corrections, for reassignments, and for keeping the most expensive weapons in reserve until truly necessary. One of the most brutal truths in modern warfare is that missed opportunities do not disappear. They compound. If the first layer reacts late, the second layer inherits a worse problem. If the second layer hesitates, the inner layer must face a denser, faster, more confused attack. That is why range-launch defense is so important. It does not require perfection. It only requires useful reduction. Every enemy drone delayed, diverted, or destroyed far from the ship makes the remaining battle easier. Every early classification reduces waste. Every track stabilized at range makes later engagements cleaner. The mothership's contribution is cumulative. It trims the raid before the raid reaches the place where mistakes become expensive. Think of it like fighting a wildfire. No serious firefighter wants the first true response to happen only when flames reach the house. Crews try to spot embers early, cut fuel lines, attack flanks, and use distance to shape the burn. A drone swarm is similar. If you can break its density, confuse its coordination, or intercept a portion while it is still spread out, you reduce the pressure on the final defensive line. The ship then faces a damaged attack instead of a pristine one. That matters because close-in defense is not just technically harder, it is emotionally harder. People under compression make worse choices. Sensors under clutter perform worse. Weapons may still function, but the system surrounding them becomes strained. Drone motherships are therefore not only about hardware efficiency, they are about reducing the psychological and systemic shock that comes from late engagement. They allow the defender to begin the conversation while the attacker is still approaching, not after the attacker has already seized the tempo. In war, that difference often decides whether a force survives in control or survives by luck. The phrase "launch defense at range" sounds simple, but it hides a doctrinal revolution. Traditional defense begins near the thing being protected. Range defense begins near the route of attack. That may sound like a small distinction, yet it changes planning, platform design, staffing, communications, and logistics. Commanders no longer ask only, "What can this ship do when threatened?" They ask, "Where should I place my forward defensive web before the threat materializes?" That leads to new questions. Which axis is most dangerous? Which platforms are expendable enough to risk far forward? Which defensive payloads make sense in weather, darkness, clutter, or coastal terrain? How much autonomy is acceptable if communications degrade? Which effects should happen automatically and which require human confirmation? In short, the mothership forces defense planners to think in terms of distributed preparation rather than centralized reaction. This is similar to how modern businesses changed once delivery networks became as important as storefronts. A company with only one beautiful flagship store may look impressive, but if all inventory and customer service are trapped inside that single building, it becomes fragile. Build a distributed network of local warehouses, mobile vans, remote ordering, and predictive delivery, and suddenly, the system handles demand shocks better. The store still matters. It is just no longer the only place where service begins. The protected warship is becoming that flagship store. It remains important, but it should not be the sole location where defense starts. The mothership acts like the forward warehouse, positioned so response can launch quickly into the area where demand, in this case threat, is most likely to emerge. Once you see the analogy, the logic becomes obvious. If the attack is coming through a corridor, put defensive capability into that corridor. If the enemy depends on compressing your timeline, begin your response outside his preferred compression zone. This is not futuristic fantasy. It is simply good systems thinking applied to warfare. There is a hidden advantage in moving the magazine outward. Most people focus on the missile count aboard the ship, and that makes sense because big interceptors are expensive, limited, and physically tied to launch cells. But a mothership carrying smaller defensive drones changes the ammunition conversation. It creates an outer, more disposable magazine layer that can be replenished, swapped, or diversified without consuming the ship's most valuable weapons first. That matters in long campaigns where the enemy's goal may be less about one perfect strike and more about exhausting the defender over time. If every cheap threat forces a premium response from the ship, the attacker may win the economic duel even before he wins tactically. Drone motherships offer a different ladder of response. A small decoy or jammer launched from a mothership might cost a fraction of a traditional interceptor. A compact hunter drone might be far cheaper than a ship-fired missile. Even when these smaller systems are imperfect, their value lies in absorbing the first layer of demand. Like using sandbags and pumps before calling in demolition crews during a flood, you save the most powerful and costly tools for the moments when lesser measures are not enough. In military terms, that can preserve scarce, high-end interceptors for the truly dangerous targets, fast missiles, complex leakers, or whatever survives the outer defensive web. The result is not just better survivability in one battle. It is greater campaign endurance. A force with distributed, layered, range-launched defense may remain in the fight longer because it manages its expensive ammunition more wisely. And when the enemy is counting on attrition by accountancy, forcing you to spend dollars like water against pennies, that magazine logic may matter as much as any single technological breakthrough. Cheap kills are not about being crude. They are about being proportionate. If an enemy sends a swarm of simple drones toward a task force, the worst possible answer is often to greet every one of them with the most exquisite missile available. That is like throwing gold bars at wasps. You may solve the immediate problem, but you are bleeding strategic value with every success. Drone motherships support cheap kills because they can carry many small, purpose-built defenders whose job is to match low-cost threats with lower-cost responses. Those responses can still be intelligent, networked, and effective. Cheap does not mean dumb. It means the cost exchange favors the defender instead of the attacker. Picture a nightclub with one massive bouncer trying to manage every problem personally. That works until too many people push at the door at once. A smarter setup adds cameras, ropes, staff with radios, ID checks farther out, and multiple smaller interventions before trouble reaches the entrance. Each measure is cheaper than a full-scale confrontation at the door, yet together they prevent the crisis from peaking. A defensive mothership works in the same way. Its many interceptors, decoys, and jammers act as lower-cost interventions earlier in the threat sequence. They do not need to be perfect alone because the power lies in layered affordability. The attacker now has to survive multiple modest, well-timed defenses instead of one premium final barrier. That can wreck his economics. If he must spend more drones to achieve the same probability of penetration, or more sophisticated guidance to resist jamming, or more coordination to overcome the distributed web, then the price of his attack rises. Good defense at range does not merely stop incoming threats. It changes the attacker's budget and planning assumptions. That is how doctrine becomes strategy. You do not just survive the raid. You make raids like that a worse bargain next time. None of this works without communications, and communications are both the nervous system and the Achilles heel of distributed defense. A mothership positioned at range must know enough to act usefully. The protected ship must trust the data coming back. Small defensive drones need cues, updates, or at least mission boundaries. If a forward defensive web loses coherence, range becomes less helpful and can even become dangerous. Friendly systems may duplicate effort, chase the wrong tracks, or leave gaps unguarded. That is why relays, resilient data links, passive sensing, local autonomy, and clear tasking logic are so central to the concept. The mothership is not just a flying storage rack. It is part carrier, part router, part local command node. Think about a family road trip with several cars. If one car has all the snacks, all the maps, and all the directions, while the others have no communication, then the whole convoy becomes fragile. A missed exit causes chaos. But if each car has navigation, some supplies, and a simple shared plan, the convoy can survive poor reception and unexpected turns. Military systems need that same balance between connectivity and independence. A defensive drone released from a mothership might receive constant guidance in a permissive environment. In a jammed fight, it may need to shift to a more autonomous mode with predefined priorities and strict boundaries. A sensor drone might serve mainly as a relay when comms are weak, then switch back to search mode later. Designing the web this way keeps the entire concept from collapsing under real battlefield friction, because the enemy will attack the network, not just the platforms. He will jam, spoof, overload, or physically target the links that make distributed defense valuable. The side that treats communications as a core weapon, not a background utility, will have a major advantage in making range-launch defense actually work under pressure. This brings us to autonomy, the part of the concept that makes many people excited and many commanders nervous. If a mothership is going to release small defenders far from the ship, some of those systems will need at least partial freedom to act. There may not be time for a human to approve every track update or every micromaneuver in a dense, fast swarm engagement. On the other hand, nobody wants uncontrolled machines making lethal mistakes in ambiguous conditions. The challenge is not whether autonomy matters. It absolutely does. The challenge is deciding where in the defensive chain autonomy should sit and where humans must retain authority. In practice, the answer will probably be layered just like the defense itself. Autonomy is best understood like cruise control and collision avoidance in a car. You are still the driver, but some functions happen faster and more reliably when the machine handles the microsecond layer. A mothership might autonomously maintain patrol position, manage its local sensor picture, or launch a relay drone when link quality drops. Small interceptors might autonomously stabilize, navigate, and pursue assigned threats within a tightly bounded area. Humans might still approve broader engagement zones, rules of action, and escalation thresholds. This division is important because the whole promise of defense at range depends on speed without chaos. If humans must manually fly every piece, the system becomes too slow. If machines are given vague authority without guardrails, trust collapses. Successful doctrine will likely split the problem: machine precision for the fast inner loop, human judgment for identity, risk, and intent. That is less dramatic than stories about killer robots, but it is far more realistic. In other words, drone motherships do not eliminate humans from defense. They allow humans to stop drowning in trivia and start making the higher-order decisions that actually protect the force. A common misconception is that more autonomous systems mean fewer people matter. In reality, distributed defense may increase the importance of human judgment because it creates more opportunities to use judgment well. In the old compressed model, crews near the protected ship may be forced into frantic, low-quality decisions under immense pressure. In the mothership model, some of that pressure is relieved. Operators can focus on broader prioritization, deception assessment, battle management, and preserving scarce high-end weapons. The outer web handles early work. The human team handles meaning. That can be a huge upgrade if designed properly. Think of a hospital emergency department. If every nurse and doctor spends all their time running for basic supplies, moving stretchers and chasing paperwork, they will make worse medical decisions. But if logistics, screening, and triage are handled intelligently, the medical staff can focus on diagnosis and care. A drone mothership plays a similar triage role for defense. It helps the force separate the early noise from the real emergency. Human operators can then ask better questions. Which tracks are decoys meant to drain ammunition? Which axis suggests a follow-on strike? Which part of the web should remain silent to preserve surprise? Which mothership should reveal itself? And which should hold? That kind of thinking is far more valuable than staring at a shrinking radar clock while trying to brute force every engagement from the deck of the ship under threat. Distributed defense does not make war simple. It makes command bandwidth more useful. And in a future conflict where commanders may need to manage swarms, decoys, electronic attack, and long-range fires all at once, useful bandwidth may be one of the rarest resources of all. Launch profiles matter more than they sound. A mothership can transform defense only if it can release its smaller systems in ways that match the battle. Some launches may be preemptive, with sensors or relays deployed before any confirmed attack. Some may be reactive, with interceptors released once suspicious tracks reach certain thresholds. Others may be opportunistic, where a mothership already in a favorable position sends out a small hunter pair simply because the geometry is too good to waste. The exact profile changes risk, surprise, endurance, and cost. Launch too early and you may expose the web or burn fuel unnecessarily. Launch too late and you lose the time advantage the concept exists to create. A good analogy is a soccer coach deciding when to press high. Press from the opening whistle and players may tire or expose gaps. Press too late and the opponent settles into rhythm. The art lies in understanding moments, cues, and field position. Drone motherships will require that same feel, only translated into doctrine, algorithms, and training. Commanders may define trigger windows based on hostile launch zones, sensor confidence, weather conditions, or fleet posture. Some motherships may hold their payloads for the second wave, when the attacker expects the defender to be depleted. Others may deliberately launch visible decoys first to trigger enemy emissions or force a swarm to reveal its control structure. There is no single magic timing rule. The deeper lesson is that the mothership gives the defender options. Before, the ship largely had to wait and react near its own body. Now, the defender can choose when and where the outer web becomes active. Choice is power. It means the attacker cannot assume the battle begins at a predictable range or under a predictable signature, and uncertainty imposed on the attacker is a form of defense in its own right. If motherships are going to carry the outer magazine, recovery and rearm become important too. Not every small defensive drone has to be one way. Some may be recoverable, especially sensors, relays, or reusable interceptors designed for multiple sorties. Others may be expendable by design because simplicity keeps them cheap and reliable. The mix matters. A force that can recover some of its outer layer tools gains endurance and flexibility. A force that treats everything as disposable gains simplicity and perhaps lower unit cost, but may strain logistics faster in extended operations. There is no universal answer. The right balance depends on mission length, industrial capacity, weather, maintenance support, and how contested the environment is. Imagine a fisherman choosing between reusable nets and single-use lines depending on the waters, the target species, and the available crew. Reusable tools make sense when conditions allow retrieval and maintenance. Disposable tools make sense when speed, simplicity, or risk dominate. Military planners will face the same trade-offs with mothership-launched defenders. A reusable sensor drone that can orbit, return, refuel, and relaunch may be highly valuable around a naval task force on extended patrol. A one-way ram interceptor may be perfect for dense terminal defense against cheap inbound threats. The mothership concept is flexible enough to support both, but that flexibility only pays off if logistics are designed honestly. Rearming a mothership at sea, swapping payload modules, refueling forward platforms, and preserving maintenance quality in harsh environments are not glamorous topics. Yet they decide whether the system remains a short demo or becomes true doctrine. A lot of futuristic military ideas die because the slide deck ignores the wrench, the fuel hose, and the spare parts crate. Drone motherships will succeed only if the boring logistics are treated as seriously as the exciting launch moment. Is less than #0. 5# is greater than. Another powerful use of motherships is deception. Because they sit forward and carry mixed payloads, they can shape what the enemy thinks he sees. A mothership might release decoys that imitate more valuable platforms, making the attacker waste range, seekers, or attention. It might emit selectively, creating false cues about the defended force's location or posture. It might launch sensor drones that watch silently while noisier decoys attract the enemy's electronic focus. In other words, the mothership can turn the outer defensive layer into a theater stage where some actors are real and some are there to pull the enemy's eyes away from the truth. Deception matters because modern attack systems often rely on sequencing. The attacker wants to find, classify, approach, and then coordinate his final run. If the mothership can corrupt that sequence early, the entire raid may become less coherent. Think of a magician forcing you to look at one hand while the real move happens elsewhere. Or think of a burglar alarm system with fake cameras mixed among real ones, motion lights in odd places, and hidden locks that waste precious seconds. Defense improves when the attacker is no longer certain which piece is worth targeting first. A mothership, by design, adds ambiguity to the battle space because it can project effects from range without immediately revealing the full structure of the defended force. Small launch systems may make the attacker suspect a larger formation, a different course, or another layer of shooters waiting unseen. Even if those suspicions are imperfect, they slow confidence and consume cognitive bandwidth. That is valuable. Every extra doubt placed into the attacker's mind is one more grain of sand in the gears of the raid. Good defense is not only steel against steel. Sometimes it is confusion against confidence. Electronic warfare makes the mothership concept even more interesting. A forward platform carrying small jamming drones or passive listening nodes can alter the electromagnetic environment before a threat reaches weapon range. It can interfere with drone navigation, degrade coordination among swarm elements, and test how the enemy reacts to spectrum pressure. Because the mothership is not sitting directly on top of the protected ship, it can also generate effects from angles the attacker did not plan for. That is important because electronic warfare is often geometry sensitive. Where the signal comes from matters. Where the target thinks it comes from matters even more. Picture a group conversation in a noisy cafe. If one person tries to speak over everyone from the center of the table, the chaos is obvious. But if several people at the edges quietly redirect attention, pass messages, and interrupt key parts of the exchange, the group dynamics change in more subtle and disruptive ways. Electronic warfare works similarly. A shipboard jammer may be powerful, but it is also a loud central actor. A forward-launched jamming node from a mothership can be smaller, more selective, and more awkward for the enemy to interpret. Is this local interference? Is it the ship? Is it another platform? Is it a decoy? By the time the attacker sorts that out, his timing may already be compromised. This is why launching defense at range is about more than intercepting physical objects. It allows a force to contest the information environment sooner and from more creative positions. And since many drones depend on guidance, navigation, networking, or at least clean sensing, information disruption may be just as important as kinetic destruction. In some cases, the best interception is making the threat arrive lost, late, or blind. Counter-swarm warfare is where drone motherships may prove most transformative. A swarm seeks to overwhelm by number, but number alone is not enough. The swarm also needs some degree of coordination, whether that is shared timing, deconfliction, target assignment, or simply synchronized arrival. Break enough of that coordination, and the swarm loses some of its collective advantage. Small defenders launched from a mothership can attack that structure directly. A few interceptor drones may physically thin the raid. A few jamming drones may fracture navigation or timing. A few decoys may cause parts of the swarm to peel off. A few sensor nodes may identify which elements are real threats and which are expendable bait. The result is not necessarily a spectacular explosion-filled victory. More often, it is the quiet collapse of coherence. Think of a pack of cyclists trying to stay in formation during a race. If the lead riders are disrupted, if crosswinds push some outward, if a few communication mistakes occur, the pack stretches and fragments. Once that happens, the aerodynamic advantage that made the pack strong begins to erode. Swarms behave similarly. Their power depends partly on arriving as a problem cluster. The mothership's outer defensive web tries to turn that cluster into scattered individual problems. A ship under attack would much rather face 10 broken singles than one organized wave of 10. That is why launching defense at range is especially attractive against drone swarms. You want to attack the swarm before it compresses onto the target. You want to bend it, fragment it, and make it waste energy organizing itself again. The closer it gets to the ship, the more its numbers matter. The farther out you hit it, the more its need for coordination becomes a weakness. That is one of the deepest strategic ideas behind the whole concept. Range is not just distance. Range is the chance to attack the enemy while he is still assembling his advantage. Now imagine a naval scenario in more concrete terms. A task group is crossing a dangerous strait. The geography favors the attacker: coastlines, islands, clutter, and short routes for hostile drone launches. In the traditional model, the fleet tightens formation and prepares to absorb the strike with shipboard defenses. In the mothership model, the task group seeds the strait with a flexible outer web. Aerial motherships patrol above likely launch corridors. Unmanned surface motherships loiter off-angle, carrying additional relays, decoys, and close-in interceptor drones. Passive sensors are pushed forward to avoid shouting with active emissions unless necessary. The defended fleet is still vulnerable, of course, but it is no longer waiting naked in the center. It has moved some of its defense into the terrain. When the hostile launch begins, the geography that was supposed to help the attacker now becomes less predictable. Small defenders can emerge from angles the attacker did not budget for. Jamming does not all originate from the ships. Decoys farther out cause early seeker confusion. Some hostile drones are intercepted before they clear clutter. Others survive but lose timing. The ships still fight, but they fight a raid that has already been touched, bent, and partially sorted. This does not guarantee safety. Nothing in warfare does. A determined enemy may still leak weapons through, but the naval force has replaced a single, shrinking defensive ring with a deeper, more elastic one. That elasticity is crucial in narrow seas and littoral zones, where line of sight, terrain masking, and clutter make last-second ship-centric defense especially stressful. Drone motherships are therefore not just ocean tools for blue water fleets. They may be most valuable exactly where the environment is ugly, compressed, and full of places for cheap threats to hide until the clock is already running out. The same logic applies on land. Consider an airbase threatened by drone raids, cruise missiles, or loitering munitions. Most people imagine defense as guns, jammers, and point defense systems around the base perimeter. Necessary, yes, but reactive and local. A land-based mothership concept changes the pattern. Trucks, large drones, or autonomous vehicles can carry forward-launched sensor swarms, interceptors, and decoys into likely approach corridors before the raid reaches the base. Some assets may orbit in the gaps between terrain features. Others may sit as mobile reserve magazines ready to deploy to threatened sectors. The defended airfield stops being a static bullseye and becomes the center of a moving defensive field. Think of protecting a house from burglars. Waiting inside with the locks engaged is one level of defense. Better is having motion lights, neighborhood cameras, a dog, and a mobile patrol checking suspicious movement down the street. The break-in is less likely because the defensive actions begin before the burglar reaches the door. A military base is the same, only more complex and lethal. If small hostile drones are allowed to appear suddenly over the runway, the defender is already late. If a forward defensive web identifies and disrupts them beyond the base, then aircraft, fuel storage, command centers, and maintenance areas gain precious survival time. Drone motherships on land may also be easier to sustain than sea-based versions in some cases because roads, shelters, and resupply are simpler. That could make ground-based experiments a proving ground for doctrines later applied at sea or in the air. In other words, the mothership concept is not married to one domain. It is a pattern. Carry defense outward. Release it where geometry helps. Make the attacker solve the problem before he reaches the thing he came to kill. Convoys and logistics ships may benefit even more than frontline warships. The military often focuses on glamorous combat platforms, yet wars are sustained by the humble traffic of fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, and replacement systems. These assets are juicy targets precisely because they are usually less well defended and more predictable. A drone mothership architecture could give convoys a way to project defensive coverage beyond the immediate deck guns and escorts. Small forward patrol drones, launched from a mothership platform embedded in the convoy or escort package, could scout likely threat vectors, provide early warning, and release interceptors before cheap attackers reach the slower, more fragile vessels. This matters strategically because an enemy may prefer to bleed your logistics rather than duel your best warships directly. It is like attacking the bloodstream instead of the fist. If drone motherships allow a convoy to defend farther out, then the attacker loses some of the easy asymmetry he hoped to exploit. He can no longer assume the transport ship is a soft target with only a last-ditch response. He may now face a roving outer web that complicates route ambushes and swarm attacks. The image to keep in mind is a wagon train with outriders. Historically, caravans and columns survived dangerous routes by pushing scouts and guards forward, sideways, and behind, not by clustering every weapon around the center wagon and waiting for contact at knife range. Modern logistics columns need the same logic, only translated into autonomous systems and networked sensors. Protecting logistics at range may not sound glamorous, but in a real campaign, it could be one of the highest payoff uses of the mothership concept. Because the force that keeps its lifelines open often wins even if its most cinematic platforms never make the headlines. Air-based defense offers another angle on why motherships matter: speed of reset. Bases and carriers both suffer from the same problem after a close-in drone attack. Even a small one can interrupt operations far beyond the physical damage caused. Flights are delayed, runways are checked, crews are exhausted, maintenance rhythms are disrupted. The attacker wins not only by destruction, but by forcing pauses. If a forward-launched defensive web stops or thins those raids at range, the protected force preserves operational tempo. That may be the difference between generating sorties and sitting still at the worst possible time. Imagine a busy train station where a prankster keeps pulling the fire alarm. Even if no real fire occurs, the repeated interruptions wreck the schedule. That is how cheap drone harassment can affect serious military operations. The defender does not need to be sunk or cratered to lose momentum. He only needs to be made uncertain often enough. Drone motherships help because they allow the defender to shift from base-centric interruption response to route-centric prevention. Aerial motherships could orbit outside the base's immediate perimeter, ready to launch hunters into likely ingress lanes. Ground motherships could move and reposition, to avoid becoming predictable. Reserve payloads could be staged based on threat intelligence, weather, and sortie schedules. The goal is not just to shoot down drones, it is to keep the protected system functioning with fewer disruptive pauses. In that sense, defense at range is also defense of rhythm. Militaries that stay on rhythm, keep initiative, maintain sortie generation, and deny the enemy the satisfaction of cheap, repeated interruption attacks. Sometimes winning means not letting the enemy ring your doorbell all night. If you want to know whether a concept is dangerous, ask what kind of problem it creates for the enemy. Drone motherships create an ugly problem because they force the attacker to search for and solve the outer web before he reaches the main target. That adds uncertainty, cost, and sequencing complexity. He may need more reconnaissance to identify mothership positions. He may need more electronic warfare to cut links. He may need faster or smarter munitions to survive early interception. He may need to split the raid, with one portion targeting the outer web and another targeting the protected asset. Every one of those adjustments increases strain on his planning and resources. This is similar to boxing against an opponent with an unpredictable jab, good footwork, and active defense. You do not just think about landing the knockout. You must spend energy solving the layers in front of it. That effort tires you, reveals your patterns, and gives the defender more chances to counter. A fleet with drone motherships becomes that annoying, exhausting opponent. The enemy can still win, of course, but he no longer gets a clean swing at the expensive target. He must deal with probes, flanking sensors, decoys, jammers, and opportunistic small interceptors before the main defensive line is even fully visible. This also complicates intelligence. The attacker may not know how many motherships are active, what payloads they carry, or which outer nodes are disposable and which are essential. That uncertainty is strategic gold. In warfare, forcing your enemy to spend scarce planning effort on incomplete information is almost as valuable as destroying one of his weapons. The mothership concept does both when used well. It imposes friction before contact is fully joined. Of course, the enemy will adapt. He may try to overwhelm the mothership layer first, either with his own cheap swarm or with long-range fires aimed at suspected forward nodes. He may use silent approaches, terrain masking, and false tracks to draw the outer web into poor positions. He may spoof the network, trying to make defenders waste payloads on ghosts or friendly signatures. He may deliberately attack communications, knowing that distributed defense depends on shared awareness. He may even use anti-radiation tactics, waiting for the mothership or its launched nodes to emit before striking. The concept is powerful, but it is not invincible. This is why good doctrine must treat the mothership as part of a contest, not a final answer. Imagine setting mousetraps in a house. If the mice become aware of the traps, they may change routes, nibble cautiously, or exploit gaps. The homeowner must then vary placement, bait, and timing. Defense is a living game. A mothership web that is too predictable will be hunted. One that emits carelessly will be mapped. One that relies on fragile communications will be broken. So the future belongs not to the side that merely buys motherships, but to the side that learns how to operate them with discipline, silence, mobility, deception, and redundancy. Some may patrol visibly as bait. Others may stay dark. Some may carry mostly decoys. Others may carry the real interceptors. Some may be expendable, others carefully preserved. Variation is protection. The attacker should never feel certain he is facing the same pattern twice. Once that uncertainty becomes permanent, the outer web starts behaving like mine warfare in the air. Not static mines, but mobile zones of risk that reshape how the enemy is willing to move. Is less than #0. 5# is greater than. Survivability of the mothership itself is a central design question. If the larger carrier node is too expensive, too obvious, or too fragile, then the concept can become self-defeating. The mothership must survive long enough to project value, or be cheap enough that losing it still makes strategic sense. This points toward a family of mothership solutions, rather than one universal form. Some may be relatively large, long-endurance aerial platforms operating farther back. Others may be smaller, numerous, and partially expendable, designed to release payloads quickly and accept risk. Some may masquerade as ordinary support assets. Some may operate in packs, so the loss of one does not collapse the web. Survivability comes from design, but also from doctrine, movement, and not being where the enemy expects. A good comparison is a queen bee versus a school bus versus a smuggler van. If you make the mothership too much like a queen bee, one precious centerpiece, the enemy gains clarity about what to kill. If you make it more like a school bus, a common carrier among many, its importance can be hidden in traffic. If you make it like a smuggler van, fast, low profile, hard to distinguish from background patterns, it becomes even more annoying to target. Military planners will likely mix these approaches. A high-end mothership may coordinate and relay from safer distance, while cheaper local launch nodes move closer to danger. That layered mothership architecture mirrors the layered defense it is trying to create. Nothing says the outer web must depend on one master platform. In fact, it probably should not. The deeper principle is distribution of function. If sensing, launch capacity, and control support are spread across several nodes, then killing one hurts, but does not blind the system. Resilience is born from overlap, not elegance. Beautiful single points of failure die dramatically. Ugly overlapping systems often win wars. Economics may be the real battlefield where this concept lives or dies. Military history is full of brilliant ideas that made tactical sense but failed because they were too costly, too maintenance-heavy, or too difficult to produce at scale. Drone motherships will need to prove not only that they work, but that they improve the defender's cost exchange over time. If the mothership and its payloads become a boutique luxury package, then the enemy may still win by mass. But if the architecture can be built modularly, sustained cheaply enough, and replenished quickly, then it starts to bend the larger campaign equation. Think about umbrellas in a city with frequent rain. A solid umbrella is useful, but only if people can afford it, replace it, carry it, and keep using it without drama. If every umbrella were handmade, fragile, and expensive, most people would just get wet. Military systems face the same reality. A forward-launched defensive layer must be practical in volume. That means payload modules that can be swapped quickly. Drones that are good enough instead of over-polished. Software that can update rapidly. Maintenance that normal units can handle without a priesthood of specialists. The best defensive revolution is often the one that ordinary formations can actually use. And there is strategic beauty in that. A force with scalable mothership doctrine may not need every ship or base to be extraordinary. It can make many ordinary assets harder to kill by surrounding them with a reasonably affordable, intelligently distributed outer web. That shifts military power from isolated jewels to resilient systems. In the long run, resilient systems usually beat impressive demos. Production matters because war consumes more than peacetime planners like to admit. Any concept built around swarms, mini interceptors, decoys, and distributed outer magazines must assume loss and replenishment as normal. The industrial base must therefore support quantity, repair, software updates, batteries, motors, seekers, communications modules, and all the tiny boring parts that sit beneath PowerPoint phrases like autonomous defensive web. This is not a weakness of the concept. It is simply reality. A system designed for repeated use in harsh conditions must be married to an industrial pipeline that can feed it under pressure. Picture a restaurant that becomes famous for a signature dish, but can only source the ingredients once a month. The recipe might be wonderful, yet the business is fragile. A real operation requires consistent supply, substitute options, prep routines, and the ability to serve the dish repeatedly on bad days, as well as good ones. Drone motherships are the same. The force that fields them effectively will not just invent clever launch tactics, it will build an ecosystem of supply and adaptation around them. That may include commercial components where sensible, modular designs for rapid repair, common interfaces between different payload types, and training pipelines that treat software maintenance as seriously as physical maintenance. It may also require accepting attritable design, systems meant to be lost in meaningful numbers without strategic heartbreak. Once again, the lesson returns. Elegant scarcity is less useful than rugged abundance. The defender who can keep replenishing the outer web after the first, second, and 10th raid will gain more from the mothership concept than the defender who unveils a brilliant prototype and then watches it disappear under the arithmetic of war. Command and control is where many futuristic concepts become painfully human again. A distributed defensive web sounds excellent until several motherships, dozens of small drones, multiple ships, and a cluttered threat picture all begin interacting in real time. Then questions multiply. Who owns which tracks? Which mothership gets first launch authority on a crossing target? How are duplicates avoided? Who decides when to reveal active emissions? How are scarce high-end interceptors reserved while cheaper outer layer tools are spent aggressively? If these questions are not solved in doctrine and training, the technology may simply create a larger, faster mess. The analogy here is an orchestra. Giving every musician a top-tier instrument does not create harmony by itself. Without a score, cues, and practice timing, the result is noise. Drone motherships need a score. That score may be part software, part doctrine, part command relationship. Some decisions must be automatic, with pre-assigned engagement zones and target classes. Others must be human-directed, especially in politically sensitive environments with civilian traffic or unclear identities. The more disciplined the score, the more the web acts like one adaptive organism instead of a pile of clever devices. This is why large exercises, simulations, and red team stress tests will matter so much. The attacker will not be polite. He will create false positives, communication loss, and awkward target overlaps, precisely where command logic is weakest. Better to discover those fractures in training than in combat. If the outer defensive layer is going to buy time, then command design must ensure that time is used well, rather than squandered in confusion. Technology extends reach. Doctrine decides whether that reach turns into power. Rules of engagement become even more delicate when defense moves outward. The farther from the protected asset you launch effects, the more likely you are to encounter ambiguity, neutral traffic, civilian clutter, and deceptive behavior. A ship firing at a threat within close range of confirmed attack can justify action more easily than a forward drone acting on imperfect cues many kilometers away. That does not invalidate the concept, but it does mean range-launch defense requires tighter identification logic and clearer engagement boundaries. Otherwise, the same system that buys time could create political and operational headaches through mistakes. Imagine a neighborhood watch. If a homeowner reacts violently to every shadow near the fence, the neighborhood becomes dangerous and absurd. But if the community builds sensible rules, cameras, communication, and escalation steps, it can respond early without becoming reckless. Military defense at range needs that same maturity. Some forward systems may be limited to sensing and tracking until confidence passes a threshold. Others may perform only non-kinetic effects unless the attack becomes unmistakable. Humans may retain veto power over certain target classes or zones. These guardrails are not bureaucratic dead weight. They are what make the doctrine sustainable in the real world. A concept that works only in perfect clarity is not much of a concept. Drone motherships will have to operate in gray zones where not every contact is clearly hostile. The side that builds strong identification discipline into its outer web will preserve both legitimacy and effectiveness. And because legitimacy affects coalition support, escalation control, and strategic narrative, rules of engagement are not separate from battlefield power. They are one of the quiet foundations of it. Training will decide whether mothership defense becomes a living skill or a museum piece. Crews must learn to think differently about battle space geometry, timing, and resource use. Operators who grew up with ship-centric defense may instinctively cling to inner-layer weapons and wait too long to trust the outer web. Others may overtrust automation and spend forward assets too quickly. Training has to build the feel of the system, when to push sensors outward, when to hold dark, when to launch interceptors early, when to preserve them, and how to interpret a changing picture across distributed nodes. This is not merely technical instruction. It is a cultural shift in how defense is imagined. A basketball team can memorize plays, but until players feel spacing, timing, and rotation under pressure, the system remains brittle. Military units are the same. They must rehearse mothership defense enough that the distributed geometry becomes intuitive. That means realistic swarm simulations, degraded communications drills, decoy-heavy scenarios, and repeated practice with mixed payload choices. It also means red teams that actively try to break operator assumptions. Perhaps the enemy attacks the relay layer first. Perhaps the first wave is nothing but bait. Perhaps coastal clutter makes the obvious target set false. The better the training, the less likely crews are to freeze when the picture turns messy. This is crucial because drone warfare punishes hesitation and habit. If units can internalize the logic of defense at range, they gain something deeper than a new tool. They gain a new instinct. And instinct, built honestly, is often what survives the shock of first contact when polished theory burns away. Before any force trusts drone motherships in war, it will need to experiment in peacetime with almost obsessive seriousness. War games and exercises should test more than simple launch success. They must measure how forward defense alters command load, signature management, ammunition consumption, operator fatigue, false track handling, and damage recovery. They should also explore ugly edge cases. What happens when weather degrades the sensor drones, but not the enemy's attack profile? What happens when a mothership goes silent unexpectedly? What happens when a decoy launch is mistaken for a primary threat axis? The value of experiments lies not in proving the concept perfect, but in discovering where it breaks. Think of a bridge engineer who stress tests a design with wind, heat, vibration, and unexpected traffic loads. The point is not to admire the blueprint. The point is to learn the conditions under which the structure begins to fail. Drone mothership doctrine deserves the same discipline. Peacetime should be used to find the breaking points mercilessly, because war certainly will. Forces should practice in coastal clutter, at night, in rain, under jamming, with civilian traffic nearby, and with adversary-style deception injected throughout. They should test how quickly payloads can be swapped, how many sorties small defenders can really fly, and how commanders react when several parts of the outer web fail at once. The side that learns these lessons early will develop resilient doctrine. The side that skips them may discover in battle that its elegant forward web was built on hidden assumptions. And hidden assumptions are among the deadliest things in war, because they collapse precisely when confidence is highest. Battle damage and resilience are where the mothership concept proves its worth. In real combat, parts of the outer web will die. Some motherships will be lost. Some relays will fall. The damage instead of validates, the damage instead of somebody. Some interceptors will miss. Some sensors will be blinded. The important question is not whether the system survives untouched. The important question is whether it degrades gracefully. A good distributed defense can lose pieces and still function. A bad one collapses once the central node is hit. That is why overlap, redundancy, and mission simplicity matters so much. Each forward element must do enough to help, but not be so important that its loss turns the rest of the architecture into confusion. A spider web is a useful metaphor. Break a strand and the web still catches. Tear the hub if everything depends on it, and the structure fails. Military planners should therefore design mothership defense more like many small web segments than one perfect geometric masterpiece. Some sensor roles should overlap. Some launch capacity should be duplicated. Some communications paths should be indirect. Some motherships should be replaceable by smaller ad hoc nodes if the original plan is damaged. The enemy will not politely attack, according to your diagram. He will try to tear where the structure is thinnest. Resilience means accepting that your first arrangement will be damaged and still ensuring the battle remains winnable after that damage. In practical terms, defense at range succeeds when the attacker cannot knock out the whole outer layer with one clever blow. He must keep solving new problems even after he scores local successes. That is exhausting, and exhaustion is the friend of the defender. Looking ahead, several technologies could make drone motherships even more potent. Better batteries or hybrid power could extend patrol endurance. Smaller, cheaper seekers could improve mini-interceptors. More capable onboard processing could reduce dependence on fragile links. Smarter sensor fusion could help small forward nodes classify targets more reliably in clutter. Modular payload bays could let a mothership shift quickly between air defense, electronic warfare, and reconnaissance support. None of these advances are magical on their own, but together they make the outer defensive web more persistent, more affordable, and more adaptable. It helps to think of smartphones. The first generations were interesting, but limited. Then, batteries improved, apps multiplied, cameras sharpened, processors accelerated, and networks expanded. Suddenly, the phone was not just a phone. It was a platform for dozens of functions that used to require separate devices. Drone motherships may follow a similar pattern. The early versions may seem narrow, carrying a handful of small defenders for specific missions. Later versions could become flexible airborne or maritime platforms that dynamically host whatever mix of outer layer effects the battle demands that day. One mission may emphasize interceptors. Another may emphasize relays, passive sensing, and decoys. Another may prioritize electronic attack. As the ecosystem matures, the concept becomes less about one vehicle and more about an architecture. That is important because architectures scale and evolve better than single-purpose gadgets. And when warfare is changing as fast as it is now, the ability to adapt the architecture may matter more than any individual performance statistic advertised in peacetime brochures. Still, there are limits. Drone motherships will not make physics disappear. Weather can ground small systems. Salt, heat, and vibration destroy reliability. Electronic warfare cuts both ways. Adversaries can saturate the outer web too, not just the inner one. Human error persists. Friendly deconfliction remains hard. And some threats may simply be too fast, too stealthy, or too numerous for a forward layer to solve completely. That is why it would be foolish to imagine motherships replacing all traditional defenses. They are a force multiplier, not a miracle. The ship, base, or convoy still needs inner layers, hardening, damage control, and disciplined crews. But recognizing limits should increase respect for the concept, not reduce it. Good military ideas rarely eliminate problems. They redistribute them into more manageable forms. Seatbelts do not abolish car crashes. Fire breaks do not abolish wildfires. What they do is improve survival odds by changing where and how danger is absorbed. Drone motherships do the same for modern defense. They shift some of the fight outward, distribute some of the workload, and buy some of the time that compressed attack seeks to steal. That is already a major achievement. The temptation in military discussion is to mock any concept that is not perfect. Real professionals know better. War is managed imperfection. A system that turns catastrophic surprise into a difficult but survivable engagement may be worth immense effort, even if it occasionally fails. The real question is never, can this make us invulnerable? The real question is, does this increase the number of futures in which we remain alive, operational, and able to fight the next hour? Drone motherships almost certainly do. So what does victory look like in a mature mothership defense architecture? It does not always look cinematic. Often it looks boring, and that is exactly the point. The best outcome is an enemy raid that never becomes dramatic because it is detected earlier, thinned sooner, confused at range, and forced into bad geometry before the protected asset feels true panic. The ships keep moving. The base keeps launching aircraft. The convoy keeps its schedule. Expensive inner layer missiles remain largely unfired because cheaper outer tools handled enough of the problem. Operators are tired, yes, but not overwhelmed. The attack was real, but it never gained the crisp, collapsing pressure it needed to become a highlight reel. That kind of victory can be unsatisfying to people who imagine warfare only through spectacular moments. But most good defense is anti-drama. It is the absence of catastrophe. Like a good roof in a storm, its greatness is measured by how little chaos enters the house. Drone motherships aim to create that quiet success by making the battle less concentrated around the protected object. They spread risk outward. They create more interception opportunities. They give the defender more ways to be correct before being forced to be perfect. And that may be the single most important advantage of all. Because in modern war, perfection is rare. Systems survive by stacking many decent choices faster than the enemy can stack problems. The mothership concept helps build that stack. It makes the defender broader, earlier, and harder to surprise. If the future battlefield belongs to swarms, deception, and time compression, then the side that learns to make defense anti-dramatic at range may be the side that stays standing after the first terrifying wave has passed. Is less than #0. 5# is greater than. Strategically, the spread of drone mothership doctrine could reshape how navies and air forces think about presence, deterrence, and vulnerability. A fleet protected by an active outer web may be willing to operate closer to danger than one forced to rely only on ship-centric defense. Logistics routes may become harder to bully. Smaller states might build more credible protective bubbles around key assets without buying only exquisite missiles. Larger powers might discover that forward defensive webs help them preserve scarce capital ships by making cheap raids less attractive. Even deterrence changes, because the enemy must now ask not only whether he can launch a swarm, but whether that swarm will survive the invisible corridor leading to the target. This is similar to how anti-submarine warfare changed naval behavior once the ocean was understood not just as open water, but as a layered sensing and attack environment. Movement patterns, escort doctrine, and strategic assumptions all changed. Drone motherships could do something similar for the air and littoral space around high-value assets. They make approach itself more dangerous. They transform the area around the target into an active defensive landscape rather than a passive buffer. That matters for geopolitics because the cheap drone era has encouraged the belief that expensive platforms are becoming helplessly exposed. Mothership defense does not erase that threat, but it pushes back against the fatalism. It says expensive assets do not have to sit like statues waiting to be surrounded. They can push a mobile, adaptive shell outward and make attackers pay more dearly for every kilometer of approach. That kind of adaptation is exactly how military relevance is preserved in eras of disruption, not by denying the threat, but by reorganizing around it faster than your opponent expects. In the end, the real genius of drone motherships is not that they carry smaller drones. Plenty of systems carry smaller systems. The genius is that they turn defense from a local reaction into a distributed act of anticipation. They acknowledge the brutal truth of modern warfare. Cheap threats arrive fast, in numbers, mixed with deception, and designed to compress decision time until even advanced forces feel clumsy. Then they answer with a different truth. Defense does not have to wait where the target stands. It can move outward. It can become mobile, layered, flexible, and economically smarter. It can meet the attack before the attack feels fully formed. That is what launching defense at range really means. It means fighting for time, geometry, and coherence before the enemy gets close enough to turn confusion into damage. So the next time you picture a warship under drone attack, do not imagine only the missiles leaving vertical launch cells or the close-in guns firing desperately near the deck. Picture something stranger and far more important. Small defenders rising from a mothership far ahead, relays stitching the picture together, decoys bending enemy attention, jammers quietly poisoning the raid, interceptors peeling threats away before the ship even becomes the center of the scene. That is the future shape of survivability. Not a thicker shell, but a farther one. Not a single last stand, but a chain of earlier choices. In the wars ahead, the forces that survive may be the ones that stop treating defense like a castle wall and start treating it like a hunting net cast far beyond the thing they value most. And once that net is in the air, the attacker's simple story changes. He is no longer flying toward one target. He is entering a web designed to make him late, blind, poor, and dead.